Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webcast Why Incomplete, Inconsistent, and Missing Definitions Cause Mayhem on Analytics and Data Governance. I'd like to start off today by introducing our main speaker, Jeff Giles, Sandhill's Enterprise Architect. Jeff has been a long-time enterprise architect and data governance expert, addressing the issues of the convergence of data modeling and data governance during the past several years. Jeff will be doing the deep dive into the specific scenarios that we have developed to show how it's possible to avoid ending up with different parts of an organization diverging in their approaches to defining key business metrics, which can often lead to substantially different decisions being made. We'd also like to welcome the Erwin team as they're part and parcel of our team. And of course, you're listening to Robert Lutton, Vice President, Sandhill Consultants. In the next 45 minutes, it's hoped that our viewers will understand the three W's of a data catalog, i.e., what does it mean, who owns the meaning, and where is it located. So with the introductions and the topic covered, I'd like to hand it over to Jeff to start the presentation by first discussing the differences between data glossary, data dictionary, and a data catalog. Jeff, over to you.
Thank you, Robert. And as Robert mentioned, we need to clarify a few terms first because we are really talking about terminology. So a lot of times I get questions, what's the difference in a glossary and a data dictionary and a data catalog? They all sound like the same thing to me. Well, there are specific differences for each one, so let's take a look at the differences. First, starting with the business glossary. This is primarily a business-focused, business language kind of a concept. It's managed by business people for business people. The data dictionary, on the other hand, is a technology-focused thing. It's really involved around data storage, what's the length, what's the precision, what's the data type, stuff like that. Even lineage is part of this data dictionary idea. And this is, of course, managed by the IT group. The last thing is the data catalog. Now, the data catalog is actually the marriage between the glossary and the data dictionary. It is essentially shows you the business term and its lineage down to where it's implemented, the technology side of things. So really, they all sort of work together, but the catalog concept is really the association of the glossary terms with the data dictionary. So that's what I hope to focus on during this presentation. There are some other things that we need to clarify as well. What is the difference in a business term, a business rule, and a business policy? So the business term are the words that describe the meaning within a specific context, right? So when we think about a term can have different meaning based on what your subject area is. Like let's take for instance, effective date. It's a fairly generic term, but effective date means something different in the context of an employee new hire or a contract or anything else that has a certain start date on it. So the definitions can change depending on the context. Business rules. Now, business rules are the criteria used to guide the business decision. So whether we should choose option A or option B or option C are generally dictated by what the business rules are. But the rules actually stem from business policies. Now, policy is sort of a broad statement of intent. It sort of drives the scope of the business behavior, lets us know where the edges are, like when we are simply out of scope when it comes to looking at a business policy. And of course, it becomes the source for the business rules. Now, often you'll be working with text that might be submitted by a business analyst or a subject matter expert, and this is generally what you get. A sales order is an internal document of the company, meaning it's generated by the company itself. Sales order should record the customer's originating purchase, blah, 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 blah. So you, as a business person, look at this and go, oh my God, what is in this thing? Now, embedded in this text, which I got from Wikipedia about what a sales order is, are the text in red is essentially telling me what does it mean. The text in blue is really business rules. And the text in green is the policy concept, and the text in purple is actually a business process. So embedded in this, what we'll call definition, a primary sort of high-level concept, it's really broken down into the different areas. So let's look at it. The policy statement is the sales order must allow for internal audit control for completeness to be monitored for regulatory compliance. That's generally the policy part of it. Then there's the rules. Sales orders must record the customer's originating purchase order. A sequential sales order number must be used by the company for its sales order documents. A sales order may contain customer purchase orders under it. Those are all the rules that govern the sales order. But the term, the basic meaning of a sales order is simply a sales order is an internal document of the company used to authorize the sale of specified items offered by the company for purchase. It's really just one sentence. So this is how things can get confusing and people might not understand what's going on. So we need to be able to look at these terms, these definitions as text, if you will, and really break it down into its component parts. So what are the values of having a business glossary? First, to maximize the understanding of the core business concepts. Secondly, to minimize the misuse of data due to inaccurate understanding of the business concepts. Third, improve the alignment of the business organization with the technology assets. Next, to maximize the accuracy of the results on the searches. So one of the things that the glossary helps you with is to define a term that's accepted by everybody so that you don't have what are called synonyms. Lots of synonyms will cause confusion. For instance, you can have effective date, hire date, date of hire, start date. All of those could be related back to the same thing, which is the date on which an employee starts working. But in order to help you with the search, you should be able to maximize that accuracy down to a defined term. Lastly, to help decision makers find relevant and timely information to support the understanding, right? So one of the things that business rules do for you is it tells you how something got calculated, like how much discount do I apply, or how are we calculating the return on investment on this? How do we handle the terms for purchasing? So all of those things together give you some business value around constructing and managing a business glossary. Now for the demonstration, we're going to use Erwin's tooling for that. So let me introduce you to the product families here. There are quite a few product families, but the ones that we're going to be concentrating on during this demonstration are these three. First, the data governance, which is really what we're going to use for the glossary management, the policies, the rules, even to a certain degree, code sets. The enterprise mapping manager, that's where we can link to the technical metadata, that stuff that we called a data dictionary earlier. That's where we can do all that. And there's another user interface called a business user portal, which gives you self-service, read-only navigation so you can go in and take a look at what's in there. Now, functionally, the Metadata Manager allows you to ingest a lot of metadata from various sources. Those sources might be data models, live running databases, text files, Excel, etc. That can all be ingested into the Metadata Manager, and then you can add more details to that. The Business Glossary Manager is that business language spoken for business people, allows them to find things in a business sense. The business portal actually publishes that, or is published information for anybody to go in and take a look at. The linkage or lineage between the Metadata Manager and the Business Glossary Manager is going to help us understand what the relationships are between these things. So as Robert mentioned earlier, what does it mean? Where is it located? Those kinds of concepts are all established by this, this linkage, this lineage. So from that, we will jump into the demonstration. So when I go into this demonstration, there's a couple of different scenarios I'm going to take a look at. The first one is submitting a new term for approval. So how does that work What's the workflow that I am going to follow for this new term, this publication of this term? Secondly, I have questions about an existing term. Who owns this term? How do I communicate with the owner to provide some feedback? And lastly, where can I find this term? Where in what system or systems might this term be used? So that's what I'm going to do right now. So let me do this. I will minimize this and jump into the Erwin Metadata Manager. So the first place I want to orient you to is here in the upper left-hand corner, where I have got a panel. And in this panel gives me different areas that I can look at. So when we were talking about the different modules that we're going to look at today, Metadata Manager is that area by which we will ingest the technical metadata so that we can see it by system. And then from within that system, there might be tables, and then those tables may have columns. But these are all technical resources. The Glossary Manager is purely business. So when we look at this, we have got business terms, business policies, and business rules. So that's where we're going to start the discussion here. First thing is that your business terms can be set up in a hierarchy. You can determine how you want to structure your business terms. Sometimes people call this a taxonomy, but essentially what it's doing is saying, I'm going to classify things. So I can have a classification of general business terms, but then I can break those down by subject areas: accounting and budgeting, human resources, invoicing, orders, people and organizations, products and services. You can structure it any way that you want, and there's no limit to the levels of hierarchy that you can have. So you can nest as deep as you want. Within each one of these business term categories is a listing of business terms. So let's take, for instance, here, orders. So when I start looking at orders here, I can see that all of these things here fall under the concept of orders. Now, remember I talked about a little bit earlier that the business term has certain context. The term can have different meaning depending on, what subject area you're looking at. So you can have a business term, let's say in accounting and budgeting, called account in one category or one classification. You can also have it in yet another one. And you have the ability to have different definitions based on that. If I were to go into, let's say, search, and I typed in account and then click the magnifying glass, what I should be able to see is that I have two instances of account. One might be for one context, one might be for another context. Sometimes there's another way of handling it where people will do what's called an enumerated definition, which I have in this particular account here, where I've basically enumerated this subject. So accounting, and this would be the definition as it relates to accounting. The same definition, but in the banking context, and then another definition in, let's say, commerce and law, et cetera. So the tool is fairly flexible, and you can set it up and structure it any way that you like. The next thing we'll take a look at is the concept of relationships between the term and other things. So if we look at something, let's say, in let's say a hierarchy or a taxonomy, and let's use orders as an example here. If I go in and I click on order, there's a little icon up here which has a mind map on it. And if I click on that mind map, what I can see here is that I have got the base order concept and the data steward. So now I know who essentially is the steward for this thing called an order. It also tells me what status it is. Is it approved? Can I actually use order without any trepidation? And if you look to the left, I've got an associated business terms, and I've got upstream associations and downstream associations, and I've also got associated business policies. So the idea here is that in a radial context, I could say, that the associated business term upstream of an order is contained within the classification of general business. Inside of an order subclassification, there's this thing called an agreement. Now, an agreement is not the same as an order specifically, but it is a kind of an agreement. So I can say upstream of this, the bigger concept is agreement, but the specific is order. And of course, downstream analysis tells me that I've got the same idea, except that an order can be broken down into a purchase order and a sales order. Now, these two things are very different in the business world, in that a purchase order is money going out of the business and a sales order is money coming into the business. But I can see that they're all related back to this idea of an order. So that shows me the upstream and downstream analysis of this order. And then the associated business policy. So I can have one or more policies associated with this. That there's a credit policy that's associated with this, this idea here as well. So if I wanted to, I could click on credit policy and it would tell me the description and the definition right from here. And if I right click on it, then I can actually view it directly and I can go jump right into it. So this is sort of a window within a window concept here that shows me the business policy details about the policy. I can set my definition here. I can set a description here. I can even edit from here. And then I can also look around and say, well, are there any other associations that might be related to this? And I can see that this is related to something called payment terms. Okay, what's payment terms? So the idea here is that I can now click around here, go to different things, and understand how the relationships between things are actually happen. So I'll close out of this real quick, and I'll close out of this. And let's take a moment and let's talk about the governance side of things here. So when you're building your business glossary, obviously you want to have what's called change control, some sort of idea that a term can be proposed, and then that term would go through an approval process. And at the end of the approval process, we will know that it's an approved term. So you can see in here on some of these things that we've got pending review, there are various statuses and things like that. So I want to introduce you to another module that's called the Workflow Manager. Now, the end users don't have to get involved in this, but the person who's more or less setting up the glossary, who's managing the glossary, would be interested in this. And what it would be is that this Workflow Manager is where you can set up various workflows depending on what you're trying to manage. So let's say, for instance, you have a specific workflow on how you do business term management, but yet your, let's say, business rules workflow is different from that, which would also maybe be different from how you manage the policies. Different people involved, different concepts, different ideas. So within this, setting up the workflow, we can come in. Now, there's different stages that this business term would pass through as it goes through this approval process. So just like a regular business process model, you've got a trigger, something that instantiates the flow. Once that happens, then it can move through the various processes until it reaches the end point, which is the publication. So we've got a review process, an approval process, and a pending process. Now, this tool comes with some generic workflows that you can use, or you can actually go ahead and define your own custom state. So you don't have to accept what's here. But essentially the way that this works is when something is in a review state, it's kind of in an iterative state. That is, somebody can propose a new term, modify an existing term, and then when they're ready, they can submit it for approval. And then when it's in the approval stage, it's locked. That is, no more changes can happen to it until it's released. If the approver decides that it's not complete, or it's missing a meaning, or there's some issue with it, they can return it back to the review status, and then it can be resubmitted. And then finally, once it's approved, go to a pending publication where maybe a manager decides to push it into the repository and make it viewable for everybody. And then that ends the process, and then you're back to the on create. So that's generally the idea. Now, as you're going through the processes, you're going to want to decide who is a reviewer, who is an approver, who is a publisher, and that's all based on roles. So if I click here on this review, I can see that the administrator is going to review it. That would be me, as well as a data steward and some of these others. Now, you can define these in another module for setting up the roles, but you can have as many roles as you want, and you can customize these to whatever you want in your environment. But once it goes through review and becomes submitted to approve, then there's an approver, which is me, and then a publisher, which is also me. And then finally, you get to this action stage of publish. So that's essentially how the workflow works here in this context. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to close this out, and I'm going to go back over to my business glossary, and I'll look at my terms here, and I will see that maybe I've got a term here called, let's say, here's one, payment terms. Doesn't even have a status yet, which essentially says that they're still working on it, but perhaps maybe they are ready to submit this payment terms into the workflow. So up here, there's this options button, and I can see my workflow queue, and I can limit this down to, let's say, object name is payment terms, and then go look for it. And I find payment terms. So then I can click on my payment terms here. And here is my definition, some additional descriptions about it. I can also see that if I look at this, this actually has an upstream association, it's something called a payment as well. And it's also tied back to a business policy called customer payment policy. And there's also some technical metadata, that is our data dictionary, that's also associated with this. Now, looking at this, I can see the information and decide, yep, it's ready to actually go to the review process. So now it's going into the review process. So here I will say, ready for review. Now, comments are especially important here because when you start looking at the history of this over time, the comments are what are going to help you understand where it was in the process and why it was submitted for review, et cetera. So here I'm simply saying it's ready for review. I'll select this. Now it tells me my workflow status updated successfully. So that's perfect. So it's now moved to the next stage. Now, if you remember, the administrator is also the person who approves, as well as the person who publishes, et cetera, which happens to be me. So I can go in here to my payment terms again. And now I have this option to say, well, I think this thing has some things that should be modified, or maybe we need to check with the SME or something like that. So I can use my notes. I can look at this thing and I can decide, okay, I want to send it back. Then I can add additional notes and send it back into the review process. But let's assume everything's good to go here. So now I can say send to approve. And I can say group has approved. So that's going to move it into this process here, and the workflow has been updated successfully. And again, I can click on this thing and it's send to pending publish, or go all the way back to review. Now let's take a look at this area over here where we have data steward, data glossary status. You can modify these data stewards and glossary status information here, But workflow status is actually driven by the workflow engine that's behind the scenes in this product. So the workflow engine is constantly looking and evaluating and driving things through. So sometimes the glossary status might not be applicable. They can just look at the workflow status, but if you want to have your own glossary status different from your workflow status, you can do that too. And here I'll just simply send this through and I'll say it's ready to go. And now it's ready to go. So this is the workflow idea behind it. So whenever you have a glossary or a business rules glossary, if you will, you want to be able to manage, how change happens within it. Because if you can't manage the change, what will happen is you'll end up with some business glossary chaos. That is, too many changes with not enough oversight. So that's the engine part. So let's take a look at this. I'll go back in here and look at this and look at we'll look at it in terms of the payment terms mind map. So we can look at this. Now, payment terms, so we looked at this with order. We saw there was upstream and downstream. Same concept here. Payment terms is related to a general business concept called invoicing, and invoicing is got this thing called payment. So I can see that. But now let's take a look at that data dictionary side of the house where we start to look at the associated technical metadata. So we can see here that we have got a system called Salesforce. And within the Salesforce system, I might actually have an application called Salesforce. I could have named this CRM if I wanted to and called this Salesforce, but in this case, it was Salesforce to Salesforce. And then I look at this, and there's something called S-Force contract. An S-Force contract has something called the contract term. Now, from a business perspective, I don't always know what this is, but if I have a report and I want to know where did this information about payment come from, I can actually go into my payment terms and I can start to look at this lineage and I can see, oh, okay, there's this thing called contact term. What are the properties of that? So then here I can start to see different information about audits, and I can send information out to Excel. But let's go into the Metadata Manager and take a look at that in a little bit more detail. Since this is the world of the data dictionary, again, here are all my systems. Now I know it came from a system called Salesforce. And so I can go into Salesforce, and then I can see, oh, it actually came from a table called contract. So then I can go through here and find contract. I can search for it. I know where it came from, so I can see it here. Click on contract. And then in contract, I have contract terms. So this is essentially where this information came from. So I can track it down to a system from this area. So essentially this starts to build up my data catalog. My catalog consists of technical information, what system did it come from, but also what does it mean in this context that I'm looking at it in. So in this CRM context, contract terms means something to do with payments on orders, but certainly contract terms as a general statement could apply to any kind of agreement that I might have, a work order, a purchase order, or supplier agreement. So this helps me understand specifically where that information comes from. Now let's go back into the Glossary Manager here and look at our general business information here and our orders. And let's say, for instance, I want to track what is the status of something within a certain workflow. Where is it in the stage idea? So I can go in here and I can say, okay, there is, actually it's in here. I can go in here and say my workflow queue. Now, if something is in process, then I can find that easily. Let's just say it's called an agreement. And I go searching for an agreement, and I find my agreement. Okay, so there's my agreement, and hang on a sec here. I'm looking for my workflow history. One quick sec. Might be outside this module. Ah, here it is. Sorry, it was in the wrong place. Workflow log. So workflow log here actually will tell me where something is. So looking at this, it hasn't been submitted for review, but once it goes to review, this area will start flashing and will indicate that it's currently in review or approval or it's pending, etc. So I can follow it through the workflow. So let's go back and take a look here at our scenarios. So creating a new term for approval, to create the term and define the term, it's good to have a workflow process so that you can follow that all the way through to the publication of that term. Scenario 2, have questions about an existing term, who owns it, look at provide information or communicate with the owner, and where is a business term used? Track the lineage. One thing that I do want to do, because I inadvertently skipped it, is this business user portal, which I talked about earlier. Now, the business user portal contains a lot of the same stuff that I just showed you in the previous modules, except this is a non-edit interface. So essentially it's read-only and allows anybody to go shopping for whatever they're looking for. So if we look at this dashboard here, I can see that I've got under data governance, business terms, policies, rules. So if I click on the terms area here, catalog of terms, catalog of policies, catalog of rules. If I look at my business tool, business here, and I'm looking for, let's say that payment terms. And I say, okay, let's go find that information. Oh, click my magnifying glass. Oh, I can do it. Oh, hang on a sec here. Perhaps I can find it this way. Ah, this is the way I found it. So same information is here, catalog hierarchy. I've got my business terms. I can export this to Excel. I get to set what kind of columns I'm interested in based on what my role is. Details about the payment terms. It's just presenting it to you in a different user interface. You can even do tags. Associated technical metadata will show up here. And all the other associations are here. Obviously, you can't modify this, but you can see the information in here, such as the mind map shows up. And this expand button is nice because it fully expands everything out in one click. But I can see all this information, and I can see that, hey, there isn't even a data steward assigned to this, and it doesn't have a status yet. But I can see that it is payment terms within the business terms. So just wanted to make sure that I talked about that before I wrap this up. But that covers the 3 scenarios that I will be using the Business Glossary Manager for. In addition to that, there are other use cases that you can use this tool for. You can use it for data migrations. We saw it with data and metadata governance to a certain degree, but you can set up code sets and and data profiles for quality. Obviously, with the business rules, you can set up your regulatory compliance and data audits, mergers and acquisitions. This would be a big one for synonyms. What's the difference between effective date, start date, hire date, date of hire, etc. Big data. You can go after the big data metadata and store that in your data dictionary. Obviously, we saw some data lineage and enterprise mapping, but more specifically, you can get into more detailed mapping with the Mapping Manager. If you want more information on that, I believe we've published a video on that one, or a webinar on that one a month or two ago. Testing and automation concepts are here, IT modernization initiatives, and cloud migration and metadata-driven automation. So I've spoken for a while. I'm just going to hand it over to Robert to close.
Thanks, Jeff. Just before we go into the call to action, one of our attendees on the call had a question. I wonder if you might be able to address it while we just ask. If there's any other questions, please feel free to go ahead and enter them in the question box. But Joel asked the question as in, what is our definition of information asset?
Information, I guess, yeah, because there's lots of different ways to look at information asset, right? So you can look at it the most granular concept, which is a term related to the storage of actual data in a system. But then you could look at it a much broader concept, and you can start to say, well, it's actually more to how do we manage the records of that data in through its full life cycle. So it really, and this is of course just my opinion, the scope of the information asset, how broad and how deep you define it. For us, we're just looking at it mostly in the metadata concept here. That is, metadata meaning and the association between that metadata and its business meaning. That's the context of this particular definition, but obviously there's more than one.
Thanks, Jeff. And for our attendees, just wanted to make sure I covered that Santel and Erwin are here to help organizations understand their business glossary from metadata to meaning. And as Jeff mentioned, this session is being recorded. We'll post it up on our YouTube channel, along with our last session we recorded just before the end of the year, which was automate the discovery of your multi-platform ETL environment for data lineage. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to actually break this down into smaller chunks so we can really do a deep dive into each particular section. Lewis just asked if we will to share this PowerPoint and also what is our YouTube channel. Thank you for that. Yes, we will send the link to this recording out to everyone and our YouTube channel. If you go onto YouTube and just look at Santel Consultants, Google that, you will see a whole bunch of playlists. Another question from Joel. Do you provide a meta model that we can extend or customize the product? Jeff, do you want to just answer that one? Is there
actually, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand this over to our Erwin folks who would probably know this in more detail. Folks at Erwin, is there a meta model available for this product?
Hi, Jeff. Am I audible?
Avi?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Avi.
Yeah. Yes, Jeff. So currently we can handle the meta model by extending user-defined fields, and there is an exclusive section called extended properties available at metadata mapping and glossary. So in that case, we can create our custom-defined fields and configure accordingly.
Is there a meta model that is published that actually shows the relationship ideas between terms, policies, rules, metadata, like a map, if you will? I agree, yes, you can extend the meta model up to 8 custom fields, but is there anything published if I were to want to look at this and see a big map laid in front of me of how all things link?
Not at this point, Jeff. So you're currently working on that. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah. So
they're currently working on that one. I guess that's the answer to that. So stay tuned.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Avi. And just for our attendees, if your organization has the use case identified or any of the other use cases that we mentioned in a previous slide, or if you're interested in learning more about how SANTL can help in this area, please feel free to do one of the following options. You can schedule a one-on-one in-depth demonstration with SANTL, where SANTL will set up a call to discuss your specific scenario in regards to the Erwin Enterprise Mapping Manager solution, and then follow up with a demonstration of scenarios. Or option number 2, you can schedule a call to do a paid proof of concept, where SANTL will set up a call to identify the success criteria and your use case scenarios, leveraging your examples of mapping and metadata to scan and deliver a proof of concept to manage a data dictionary, mappings, and view impact analysis and end-to-end lineage to a measured outcome. For either option, please feel free to contact myself, Robert Lutton at SANTL Consultants. You can see my email address on the screen there, and you can also visit our webpage for more information. So I believe that that's all the questions there are. We would like to thank all our attendees. It's been a pleasure presenting our views on why incomplete, inconsistent, and missing definitions cause mayhems on analytics and data governance. And we look forward to hearing from you all in the near future, and look forward to our follow-up webcast as well. Thank you. Bye.